Welcome to Ditch Auto. My name's Jerad, and today we're here with the DJI Phantom 4 Pro, and we're talking about the top 5 video settings that you should change. Now, these are video settings that I use, and I think that they're super important to have adjusted because, the camera in this thing is not perfect. It is really good, and it's came a long way over the years, but it's still not as good as a DSLR camera or, some of the more professional cameras out there like what comes on the Inspire 1 or Inspire 2. So with these settings, it's going to help you get a better image out of your drone that you can use for editing or doing whatever you want with. And these 5 settings that I change definitely make for a better overall experience. Now, I recently did a video on, of course, doing these things and making these changes and everything for photo. So if you are also interested in making some adjustments to your drone for shooting better photos, make sure to check out that video. I'll link it in the description below. And then we also have a manual photography video on how to shoot in manual mode with your Phantom. It definitely helps you better control your exposure and just what your camera is doing so that you can get better, more consistent shots. And of course, that video works for both photo and when you're shooting in video mode as well. So I'll link that up in the description below and at the end of this video. All right, so the first thing that you need to do is make sure that you are in video mode. That means tapping the button right above the shutter. If the shutter is white, you're in photo mode. If the shutter is red, you are in video mode. So we're gonna spend the majority of our time here in that button that's right underneath the shutter, which is the camera settings. And when you're in video mode, there's 3 panels here. And when you're in video mode, the middle panel is video options. When you're in photo mode, that middle panel is photo options. So if you're wondering why you're not seeing video options, it's probably because you're in photo mode. All right, so we're on the main screen here. This is the one that I spend the majority of my time in when I'm flying. I'm adjusting my aperture, my shutter speed, and sometimes my ISO, depending on how bright it is, depending on if I have a ND filter on the camera on the front of my drone. And so I spend most of my time right here. But when there's settings that I need to change, I go into those other 2 panels, and that is this next panel here that we're looking at. Now, here are some things that I change. Now, the first thing I do is go into my video size. Now, with this drone, it captures great video, and it shoots in 4K. It does shoot in 4K at up to 48 frames per second, which is great. If you go into full 4K, you get even 60 frames per second, which is pretty cool. A lot of times I'm shooting in UHD because I'm not. UHD is the 4K below full 4K. It's the 3840 by 2160 versus the 4096 by 2160. And sometimes the reason that I'm in that 3840 by 2160 is because a majority of the time I'm taking that 4K footage and shrinking it down to 1080. I don't necessarily need that 4K footage to be on YouTube when I'm making a video. I just shoot in 4K because that's a lot more data, and I could bring that down into 1080, and it just seems like you get a little bit better footage when you start out with a bigger image. It also allows you to punch in, so maybe you weren't able to get as close to something as you want, but when you shoot in 4K, you actually can crop in and still have a 1080 video and crop in. So I always shoot in 4K. It does produce a much larger video size, and it does tend to eat through SD cards, but I always shoot in 4K because it gives me that ability to crop in. And if you try to zoom in with the app here, if you try to zoom in, or with your editing your video, if you try to zoom in or crop in, you're gonna lose a lot of detail. Your image is not gonna be as good. And so I always shoot in 4K, knowing that I'm going to edit in 1080, which is regular HD, or full HD, I guess you could say now. And that definitely gives me more information to work with. So I recommend shooting in 4K. It's the first setting that I change, is to go and shoot in 4K, and then I edit in HD, and that's what I end up sharing to the internet. So with the frames per second, typically you would want to choose a FPS that is conducive with what you're trying to do. So if you know that you're going to be shooting something and you're going to want to slow it down, do some slow motion, then I recommend shooting at least 60 FPS, if not going with a higher option, such as maybe shooting at 1080 so that you get the option of 120 frames per second. 120 frames per second gives you a lot more information there so that you can slow down and stretch out that footage and get some nice looking slow motion. I typically am not doing a whole lot of slow motion. If I do slow something down, I'm not slowing it down a ton. So I prefer to shoot in 4K and either shooting at 60 frames per second or 30 frames per second so that I have that extra crop room. I'd rather be able to crop and zoom or move, maybe even make a motion while in the editing process in the footage, and you just don't have that extra real estate when you shoot in HD. So typically I'm shooting in 4K, and in the video format, I'm usually in .mov. Even though now I'm a Windows user more, and .mov is not, it's more of an Apple supported codec. It's just fine in Windows. The videos open, they play, they edit, it doesn't really matter. I just choose MOV over MP4 because MOV seems to give us more options, more frames per second options than when we go into MP4 mode. And likewise, I even hear with shooting in NTSC versus PAL, I even hear a lot of people, even if you're not in the United States, shooting in NTSC because they'd rather have the 30 frames per second, or they'd rather have some of those higher frame rates that just aren't the same when they're shooting in PAL. So that was a lot for the first thing that I changed. I wanted to kind of mash all those in together because those have to do with video size, video frame rates and stuff like that. And I find that they're really important to pay attention to. Don't just shoot in any mode. Think about what you're wanting to do with your footage and then shoot in the correct mode that works for what you're shooting. If you have any questions about that, ask them in the comments below and I'll do my best to answer them for you. So the next thing I do is I get into a white balance setting. I do not use auto white balance. I use typically either cloudy or sunny, or I may even go into custom and set the custom white balance by moving the slider around and adjusting the white balance to where I want it to be. The reason I do this is because when you're shooting video and you're flying your drone around and the exposure is changing, or maybe the direction of the drone is changing a little bit, and the angle of the sun and where the light sources are coming from is changing a little bit, your camera, if it's in auto white balance, it is changing the color temperature of your image as you move around. And so you may be flying in one direction and your image looks great, it's warm looking, nice crisp image, but it's not too warm, and then you turn 90 degrees and all of a sudden your image is super cool and blue and it just doesn't look as good. Now the auto white balance is pretty decent in this camera. DJI has done a great job, but just like any camera, even the higher end DSLRs, if you leave it in auto white balance, chances are you're gonna have some variations, and color correcting video footage that is not raw and that has a change like that mid-clip, like in the middle of the clip it happens. It's not one clip is a certain color temperature and the next clip is another temperature and you can just color correct the clip to match the other one. Like if it happens gradually, like as you pan the camera, it's changing that color temperature. Like that is super hard to color correct and it just makes for a poorer quality image. And so I go with a white balance, either cloudy, sunny, or I choose a custom white balance and just move the slider around until I get the color temperature that I'm looking for. And I usually do that really quickly when I'm up in the sky. It's really easy just to come in here and make that adjustment quickly. So I, most of the time, leave it in cloudy. I like the way cloudy looks, even on days that are extremely sunny. On days that are extremely sunny where the image looks a little too warm, simply just tap on the sunny option. It will cool it down just a little bit and make your image look great, and it will be consistent. That's what's important. All right, so now we've got the white balance. I now then go into style. Now, what you can see on my screen here is a style that I've already adjusted. Typically, your camera is going to be on standard, which is zeroed out all the way across. That's 0 on the sharpening, 0 on the contrast, and 0 on the color vibrance. And I typically go and subdue these a bit. I don't want any sharpening to happen on the camera. Typically these cameras, these, sensors that are, they're good, but they're not as good as the sensors that are in our higher end pro level cameras. When you add sharpening to it, it just makes everything look a little too, over processed, and I want that all off. I want a softer looking image out of the camera that I can then sharpen with software that does a really good job, sharpening and doing that post-production in Premiere or, some software application for video editing definitely does a better job than the processing that can happen here in this little system. So I turn down sharpening. That's the first row here. The little triangle is your sharpening. I typically turn that one down all the way to -3. And these style settings, the white balance settings and the style settings right here, whether you're in photo mode or video mode, these are going to be the same. And as I talked about in the video on the top 5 photo settings, I set this the same. I want a flatter image for photography. I want a flatter image for video so that I can post-process it the way that I want and give it the style that I want. So then in the next option under contrast, I typically go down, -1 or -2. I don't get too crazy with going down on the contrast too much. I just don't want it to be over-processed with the contrast. When you over-process the contrast, it crushes the midtones by making the highlights and the shadows much more noticeable. And so your ability to move that around a little bit or subdue the contrast or add contrast more naturally is lessened because you have added it in the camera. And then the last one is just the color vibrance over here. You can bump this up and get some really warm looking, you could even see here, even just the camera pointing at the table here. As I bump that up to 3, it's just a lot. And as I kind of drop this color vibrance down, it just takes that away and gives me a more flatter color plane across the board. And you can add this back in post-production when you're color correcting. And for me, I found that that's just much better. Even if all you're doing is taking your footage and putting it in Final Cut Pro or Adobe Premiere Pro and then just dropping a filter or dropping a preset on top of it, that still is better than letting it all happen inside the camera, because the camera, it does an okay job, but it doesn't do that great of a job. So the style settings, we go and adjust those. I then go into the color settings, and the color settings I typically choose D-Cine-alike. D-Log, and there are some other settings that are in here, and you can play with those, and maybe even those color settings will produce a profile and a look that you would like to have just out of camera, and that's totally cool. But for me, I choose D-Cine-alike because I want it to be slightly flatter, not so flat like D-Log, which is extremely flat. I give it the D-Cine-alike because it's not as flat as, or it's not as processed as none. And there's even, true color, and there's some other options that are on here that are pretty processy. But typically D-Cine-alike is pretty good for me. If I want something really flat, I will go with D-Log, but that is if I typically only shoot in D-Log if I'm gonna be editing footage together from the drone with footage from other cameras, and I just want flat, because my other cameras I'm probably shooting in a log, some form of a log format as well. And so I will go into D-Log if I'm shooting with other cameras. If I'm just editing footage off of the Phantom 4, or maybe even my Inspire 2 or a Mavic per se, then I'll just go with D-Cine-alike because it's a little less work that I have to do, but it still gives me the range to make adjustments. All right, so let's get out of that mode. So one of the last things that I change is in the next tab under the settings, which these are global settings for both photo and video. And you'll see the histogram. When I tap on histogram, it pops up. And this is a floating menu that I can kind of move around and position where I want it to be, which is great because sometimes you want it to be out of the way and it shows up over the top of other things. What's cool about the histogram is it gives you a look at your exposure without you having to sit there and look at your image and look at all the details, which is really hard to do while you're flying. The histogram shows you all of your darkness to brightness values. And you can see here, because the camera, everything's kind of underexposed right now, everything is leaning over towards the left, towards the darker side. And if you're flying around and that histogram is not evenly spread out all the way across, maybe it's over to the left, it tells me that I need to increase my exposure a little bit because I don't really have any bright areas in this image. If I move it over the other way, or if it's showing up the other way, I know that things are overexposed, and that that's gonna cause a problem there as well. So I'm gonna tilt the camera, or try to tilt the camera up a little bit and move it towards the light, and you can see the histogram change now. You can see that the histogram is more even, and as I move it, I'm messing with my drone here, trying to move it towards the light, you can see it definitely changed that histogram, and it's good to have that information. It helps you better choose, what you're going to expose, how you're going to expose your image without having to look at the image and try and figure it out, which the image that we're seeing on the screen is not true anyways, because it's only 720p. It's compressed like crazy, so we're not seeing the best image on our display screen anyways, so relying on the histogram definitely helps you get a better exposure and have a better look at what the camera is actually seeing. Now, as we scroll down, there are other options, and one that I use is Gridlines. Gridlines helps you keep things composed. When you're flying around and trying to line things up on the screen and make them look good, having those grid lines helps because you're flying, you're trying to keep your drone in the air and keep it from hitting things and keep it going in a direction that you want it to go. And having the lines on the screen makes it so much easier for you to keep things composed, to keep, maybe in the rule of thirds, there's a lot of different ways that you can use the rule of thirds. Typically, you would line up your subject or your point of interest along one of the intersecting lines. And there's a lot of different ways that you can use the rule of thirds depending on, that style, that feel, that emotion that you're going for. But I like having the grid lines there because with the grid lines there, it gives me one less thing to think about. I know that I wanna, I'm flying over the top of somebody, I want them to be at the bottom of my scene, so I might line their head up with the bottom line and then put them towards the bottom. It just makes it so much easier for me to line things up. Or maybe I'm flying towards something and I want it to appear on the left side of my screen and I want to keep it consistent. Having that line there just makes it easier. It's like looking through a target on a gun, or looking through a gun at a target. You're using the cross section to align and to keep your shot lined up so that you hit the target. And without that, you're just guessing. And so having the grid lines or the rule of thirds there is definitely helps. So, there's lots of things that you can do. The main screen that I spend on is this one here. I have it in manual mode. I'm messing with my ISO, my shutter speed, my aperture, and all that stuff. If you want more information about this, go and check out our other video on shooting in manual mode with your DJI Phantom. It will help you understand manual settings a bit better. I hope this video helped you out. There are a lot of videos that we are putting out and trying to get as much information out there about the Phantom as possible to help you guys take better photos, shoot better video, and just all around be better at using your drone for capturing media, because it's most likely why we got this. Why we got this is so we could take cool pictures, shoot cool video, and that's what we want to help you do. So subscribe to our channel so that you can be notified when we put out new videos. Click on the thumbs up if this video was useful to you. We appreciate that feedback. And make sure to check out links in the description below to some of the other videos that we've produced for the Phantom 4, and then some of our favorite accessories for the Phantom 4. So thanks so much for checking out this video here on Ditch Auto, and we hope to see you back soon. Thanks.